Hello there. So we are continuing with our animated accessory that we were setting up the other day. So to recap what we've done so far, when we're setting up accessory items for animation, we have to first decide what armature that we're going to use. So we're using the accessory file because that contains all the relevant armatures representing each bone of the avatar. And once we make our selection, we are adding bones to that armature. So we're going into edit mode once we've got our selection made. And we are, let's just disable in front to make selection of the bones easier. Or it should do. Right, so we've got our two bones that are in the default armature. So that's accessory node and accessory, oh, not accessory node, attachment node and attachment root. And all we've done is essentially selected one of these bones and duplicated them. So armature, duplicate. That creates a new bone, which we then reposition using the widgets. So we've got our transform widget active at the moment. So all we've done is moved that copy or that duplicate into position. We've done it again to create our second bone that we need for the eyeball for this particular item. And it's positioned because we need a specific type of animation ability, for want of a better way of putting it. So this bone has to be positioned at the center of the eyeball, which is a sphere. So to make sure that that rotates spherically, so it does what it's supposed to do as a sphere instead of being wonky or off kilter, we have to make sure that the head of the bone is at the center of the eyeball. And we can do that using the, let's just switch back to object. We can do that using, oh well, we can't do it now because we've joined the meshes together ready for animation. But let's go back a couple of versions. So the eyeball has an origin point, and that's at the center of the mesh, and we're using that to locate the bone relative to the eyeball, so that we can then, once we start animating, we can actually start manipulating the bone and it'll rotate the way that we expect an eyeball to rotate. So we use the snap tools for that. And then what we finally do is make sure that the parenting, the relationship between the bones, is set up so that if there's multiple bones, each bone controls a particular element of the mesh relative to what that mesh is supposed to do. So this bone controls only the eye, and this bone controls the whole thing, including the eye. So when this bone moves, the whole thing moves. So we use the parent relationship, or the relationship, where is it? Are we in edit mode? No, we're not. Edit mode, select bone, and we're in bone properties, and we're setting up the parent relationship. So this bone, the eyeball, is connected to the pumpkin is connected to attachment root. So with all of that set up, we can now do some animating. So we'll just do some very simple basic animation. Whoops. So just double check that we've got everything set up. So the mesh is also parented to the armature so that we can, if we need to, we can move the armature and the mesh will move with it. Otherwise we have to switch to pose mode and select an appropriate bone to move the mesh. Right, so we're going to do some animation. So we can, just looking at this, let's just do a simple side-to-side motion, or as if the pumpkin is looking around, like so. So what we want to do is use this bone to control the whole pumpkin. So select our armature. We're in the action editor, so we need to switch from the timeline, which is the default. So that's the default normally. We want, whoops, dope sheet, and then action editor. So there are several ways of creating animations for IMVU, but they all have to have an action. So it doesn't matter how the animation is created, at the end of the day, the animation has to have an action. Otherwise, IMVU won't recognize the animation file. It may bring it in, but it won't be able to use it. So make sure you always switch to the action editor at the end of the day, once you've got your sequence set up. For example, actually, whilst we've got this, the pumpkin does have a shape key animation associated with it. So in context of what we were just talking about, if we export this now, this won't work. This animation may be in the file, in the FBX file, but IMVU won't recognize it. So to complete that process, to make sure that IMVU does recognize it, we have to switch to the action editor and associate an action with the sequence. That's just shifted it, because when this action was created originally, the mesh was positioned at the center of the grid. So we have to I wonder if, so let's just undo that. But anyway, so you have to have an action associated with the sequence in order for IMVU to recognize it. So let's just create our animation. So select our armature, switch to pose mode, and we can check that because the bones highlight blue. And all we're going to do is move the marker to frame 1, or start your animations on frame 1, and we'll just insert a keyframe. For that, all we need to do is key, insert keyframe, all channels, only selected channels, or in active groups, so we can do all channels. Why hasn't that worked? Oh, we've forgotten to create a sequence. So click new. Now we should be able to do it. Dang it, why isn't that working? Press the I key. Oh, that's right. That was the wrong menu. So the key menu, this header running along here, is associated with the action editor. What we should have been doing is clicking on the pose menu at the top there. So we've created our action. We didn't need to do that because pose, animation, insert keyframe. We'll get this pop up, and for IMVU we just need location and rotation. It'll automatically drop in a keyframe, and it'll also create a sequence. So we can rename this. Look around dot action. Press the shield icon. This ensures that the data that we create stays in place, so IMVU doesn't forget it when the file is saved and reopened at a later point. So that's our starting point. We want to make sure that we are set to 30 frames a second. That's what IMVU uses. Where is that? Output properties and frame rate. So it is set to 30. I think by default it's set to 24. So change that to 30 and we'll be matching IMVU. So let's do 90. So we're going to set another keyframe, location, rotation. So those are our start and end points. And then all we need to do, widget, rotate, insert. So this is pressing the I key, which is the shortcut. And that is our pose. Let's reset that. So another keyframe, pose, clear transform, rotation. That resets it. Insert. So we've got a start, a twist, return, another keyframe, insert, and then maybe a slow return. So if we play this, so we want to set, as we are already in, what is that? Render, not render properties, output properties. We want to set our frame range. So we can set an end point. We've got 90 frames, so we can change this to 90. So click, type. Then all we need to do is press the space bar. So it's a bit robotic, or not robotic, can't think of the word. It works, but it's not very interesting. Let's save the file, save as 12. So what we want to do here, hi Oliver. So what we want to do here is change the apparent behavior of how it moves based on placing some more keyframes. But if we keep this as our fundamental action, or the fundamental movement that the object does, so it swings to the left, back to its recenters, swings to the right, or its left and its right, and then back again. What we want to do is maybe make that a sharp movement. So we can select the bone that we set at frame 1, pose, copy pose. And what this does is it copies the coordinates, so that's the location, rotation, coordinates of this particular bone. So we're going to copy that. And what we can do is move the timeline slider to another frame, and we can paste that in place. Paste pose. And that'll snap, well, relatively speaking, it snaps the character back into position because it's dropped in the coordinates that we had. So we'll lose the coordinates if I move this. It's dropped in the coordinates that were set at frame 1 at frame 13. So let's do that again. But we now need to make sure that we insert this change. So press the I key, or again, pose, animation, insert keyframe. So the shortcut there is the letter I. And it'll give us this pop-up insert keyframe menu, location, rotation. So now the character stays put and then quickly swings to the left or its right, then slowly back, and then we can do the same thing again. We can still use the coordinate data that's at frame 1 and drop that at frame 48. So insert, so press the I key again. So it quickly swings to the right. And then slowly back. Might be a bit too quick, but what we can also then do swings to the right. Whilst that bone is still selected, pose, copy pose, paste pose, insert. It'll stay at that position for a short time, swing back. So again, copy. Maybe let's have that one a bit longer. Paste, insert. So what we now have, that's still quite quick. So what we want to do is select, we're going to change the duration of the sequence, so we're going to make it longer, because what we want to do is increase the length of these pauses. Well, it's this pause and this pause, but to do that we have to make the length or the overall duration much longer to compensate. So let's try 180. Let's just double it. So we can do that two ways. We can press the B key when we have the mouse over the action editor. Press the B key and we get the box select tool. Click drag and we select a series of keyframes. So each one of these is a keyframe. Or we can Alt right click if you have right click set up on your mouse as your selection tool, and then Shift Alt and we can select multiple keyframes. So either or, box select or Alt click. Then all we need to do is just press the G key and we can move the sequence, make it much longer. And the keyframes snap to the grid, so we don't have to do anything. So that's that one. And then this one. So press G. So it ends at 180. So now we've changed the overall length. We'll also want to change the end. That should also now be 180. So if we press the space bar now, that's much better. But to make it more interesting, what we can do is move the eyeball. So let's just, we want to see, so every bone that's selected will have a set of keyframes associated with it. But by default, Blender only displays the keyframes of the selected bone. So to see all the bones, what you need to do is disable this. That's the show only selected option. So if we click that off, we'll then see all the bones. Not sure why that's not actually listed. It should be. But we've got our eye control selected now. And what we'll do is set our initial pose, or the start, again location, rotation, and end. And then we can start. So insert, insert, insert. Now we need to reset. So we can do one or two things. We can either copy the pose that's at frame 1, or we can just reset the bone. So pose, which is what we did before, clear transform all, and it just resets it. Insert, so that locks that data in place. In fact, let's move this. So I'm going to move this keyframe, and we're going to drop it here. So select, press the G key, and just move it. Do the same on the other side. Insert. So copy that pose. whoops, that pose. Drop that in at frame 150. Why hasn't that dropped in? That should have dropped in a keyframe. Oh, that's right. Insert. So what we end up with, press the space bar, is the eyeball now moves. So obviously there's a ton of stuff you can do with this. So let's slow that down. So we want to move this keyframe, or this set of keyframes. So that's the frames associated with those two bones. We want to move those. So Alt click, left or right, depending on how you've got your mouse set up. Press the G key. Let's try changing the speed of that. So we don't want the eye to move. Copy pose. Too much. Paste. Insert. So maybe. So what we're doing now is essentially getting into what's called secondary animation motion. So the primary motion is the pumpkin itself just moving. And the secondary motions are all these little things, the little twitches. Obviously the character has no arms, it's just got the eyes and the eyelids. So secondary animation would be the twitching of the eye and the eyelid when we get that set up. But the trick to animation isn't the process, the difficulty I should say. The difficulty is not the process, it's not this, it's not laying out all these keyframes. That's easy. People often get confused or intimidated by what a timeline looks like. All it is just a series of markers that store coordinates for each bone. That's all it is. The trick or the difficulty is in making your animated object appear. See, just adding a delay in the way that the eyeball, so if we just get rid of that and do that, so that delay that's added at this keyframe here adds a bit more realism isn't the right word, but the way that it replicates the way that you look or the way that the eye generally looks around, it's not a smooth transition. It jumps and jerks around when it moves, which is why you blink, because if you didn't blink, you confuse your brain, basically. So if we add all these little, so let's just undo that, edit, undo. Will that drop that back into place? Yes, it has. So we delay the eyeball returning back to its position, so we end up with a desynchronized movement. So you don't want the eyeball, in this particular example, you don't want the eyeball and the pumpkin body moving at the same time. You don't want them synchronized, you want them desynchronized. And it's those little tweaks that make or break your animation sequences. And it doesn't matter what you are animated. I mean, in the previous video, we were just saying this is a pet from a catalog category point of view. This is a pet, but from a technical perspective, it's just an accessory. It uses the accessory skeleton, and just the same way as if you were making a ring or a set of earrings, it would be exactly the same process. If you wanted to animate your earrings, for example, notwithstanding the fact that you've got your armature all set up, so you've got extra bones. Whoops, it's a bit big. So you've got your extra bones, and you position them so that the head of the bone, that's the bit, the round sphere at the fat end of the bone. So you've got your bones arranged like so. What you want to avoid doing is moving the so if you've got if you're animating a pair of drop earrings or loops, it doesn't really matter. So let's say we were animating a pair of loops. What you want to try and avoid doing is animating them so that this is your pivot point, so the earring is rocking back and forth against that pivot, and that pivot is where the ear is pierced, which is your rotational axis. So what you want to avoid doing is moving the two earrings at the same time so they do the same thing. Desynchronize them. So this one might swing that way whilst this one, whoops, is swinging that way. But it could be a subtle difference, a subtle change, and that's all you need to make your earrings look more realistic, for want of a better word, in their animation. If you synchronize them, you end up in uncanny valley territory, because the earrings are doing something that they wouldn't ordinarily do. It's impossible for them to do that in real life. So if you think in terms of the way that things behave in real life, you don't necessarily have to be super accurate with your animation. The thing that makes the animation is the fact that everything is desynchronized. Things do not synchronize together. So if you imagine shaking your head, your earrings aren't going to move in the same direction at the same time. So that's all you need to do with your animation, is just keep that in mind. It doesn't matter whether it's for earrings, ring, wrist armbands, tail, doesn't matter, it's all the same. So we have a sequence that we can try an export for. So file, let's just save this. File save as 13. Save as. Now for export, as mentioned at the beginning, we are in the action editor because we've made our sequence by posing. We physically posed the bones, so we've changed the positions of the bones. And we've done that within the action editor. So all we need to do is select the armature. I haven't done this in a while. Select the mesh, armature, file, export, FBX, and hopefully this will work because I haven't done one in a while. We want selected objects. Everything else is okay. Geometry, that's all right. Armature, always disable add leaf bones as usual. Now we have an animation for this, so we need to expand the bake animation options. So click on the little triangle thingy, and we need to disable NLA strips and force start end keying. So what we end up with is just key all bones and all actions. Everything else is okay. File name, that's all right. Folder location, that's okay. So let's just export. So, Studio. No idea if this is going to work in Studio. Right, full screen. So, create, accessories, get the glasses. Thank you very much. Elvis is caught in a cage. That's Halloween Elvis. Derive. Need to just get rid of the cage for the moment. So we want inventory. Click on the button with the sliders. In use. Find our item. There it is. And then click on the item to just remove it. There it goes. Close that. Right, so import. Click on the import button. Import FBX. Find our Pumpkin 13. Open. Ooh, looks like this is going to work. So it's giving us a preview of what it's found in the FBX file. Set up FBX. Change the scale. If we're using the starter files, 0.01. Select the right bone or the right skeleton. And again, it's generally speaking always going to be the one with the fewest number of bones. So 4 bones, 1 mesh in this case. We've got our mesh. Next. Got our materials. Next. It's now found our animation. So review. That looks okay. And then import. So again, it defaults to the head bone. So we need to change that. So component, skeleton. So that's the skeleton. We need to change the node that it's attached to. At the moment it's head. So this is female 03 master root because we've rooted it to the foot of the avatar. So the avatar will move independently of anything the pet, air quotes, the pet does. So head, female 03, click, preview. It's dropped it into place. So what we need to do now is set up the animation. So actions, no action, so click on the plus. That creates our new action, which we can rename over here. Let's call this look-see. So that's changed the action name. That's also the trigger. So we'll have to type look-see. So no ensembles, so click on the plus. So if we wanted this to automatically play, that would be stance.idle. Right, so the asset. Female master root, attachment root, so that's our skeleton. And that's the animation sequence. Speed 100, that's fine. Duration, that's fine. Let's just loop this 5 times. No blend, replace. We don't have a morph animation yet. Oh, and so there is no morph animation. So this is what was meant about having an action that's associated with any sequence that you create. Because, as was mentioned at the beginning, there is a shape key animation with this, but because there isn't a corresponding action associated with it, it hasn't exported the action. That's the blink. That's a shape key animation. So this is what was meant about having an action that's associated with that corresponds, that's a better word, corresponds to any sequence that you create. So in Studio, because we don't have a corresponding action for that, it hasn't brought in morph animation. So that's blank. Right, so that's okay, that's okay. That's all right. That's okay. Disable gaze, well, we don't need that. Apply. Preview. So we can change that. Actually, let's just do that. Stance.idle. Preview. And it should. And there it is playing. Obviously, for something like this, you'd have a different idle animation. It might just be the pumpkin looking forward, blinking. So you'd have 2 animation sequences: the pumpkin looking forward, and then the morph animation, which is the blink. And then you would have something like this triggered if, let's say somebody said the word look. Or type the word look. We can test our trigger. And it would play that sequence when the word look is typed into chat. So let's do what we could do. Skeleton. Oh, shape key. So switch back to Action Editor. There we go. Look around. Whoops. Let's make a quick change. Sometimes that's all it takes. You don't need to go back into pose mode. You can sometimes remain in object mode, and all we need to do is just move the position of the keyframes and we're updating the sequence without having to do anything else. So let's change that. Actually, speaking of which, let's change that so that copy insert keyframe. Let's shift that. Yeah, that'll do. So save that. But let's create an idle animation. Hey Queen. Let's create an idle. So we don't necessarily need to change modes. All we need to do is just create a new action. So we click on the folder icon. That will duplicate the sequence that we had open, so we can select all of this and just delete it. Where's delete on this? Don't want to delete the channel, just want to delete the sequence data. Oh well, just delete all of that. So we've got a blank sequence and we're going to create... yes, Queen, you can ask a question. It's just going to be an idle animation, so... make sure everything is reset, so select our bones, pose, clear transform, all. Just make sure everything's reset. Then with both bones selected in this particular instance, press the I key and just insert our base poses. Let's make this 60 frames. Now this could be tricky because FBX IMVU doesn't like this type of sequence where the start frame and the end frame are exactly the same, so there's nothing going on inside the file. So this could be let's just rename this. So we've got our sequence. Let's just call this idle dot action. So we've now got, oh, and press the shield. So we've now got a couple of sequences. So we also want one to correspond to shape key sequence. That's 15 frames. So create a new one. What was that called? Uniblink. Uniblink. Dot action. So there's a duplicate of this, so we can force the renaming of the one that we just created, delete the append, the .001, enter, and that forces this one to be Uniblink and the original one to be updated with the append, so that can be ignored. So that's 15 frames long. So I can't remember if, I think, right, so we'll have to remember the coordinates, undo. So what's the coordinates of our object? So 390. So this is the position of the mesh, and we need to change that. So 300. Oh, it's done it already. So yeah, so 300. Insert keyframe. So this is the, it's not a problem per se, but the flexibility of Blender's animation system means that you can animate objects without a skeleton. So you have to be careful sometimes when you are creating animations that when you set up your objects, you're always at keyframe 1 or 0 whilst you are working, because what can inadvertently happen is that, let's say you were working on a sequence and you have the timeline marker at frame 15. Whatever you do in the main 3D view will be stored as a keyframe, a pose, or a coordinates. The coordinates will be saved to the keyframe, which is why this shifts back to 0. Whoops, shifts back to 0 at frame 15, because we didn't compensate, or this animation was in place when we moved this object where it needs to be. So keep an eye out for that as you are working. So 390, that's all right. Uniblink mesh action. So I'm just doing this because I cannot remember from the top of my head, because we have a shape key associated with the mesh, that the corresponding action needs to be linked to the mesh not the armature. So we'll find out during export. So calling this uniblink mesh.action will clarify between that and uniblink. Did you ask your question, Queen? Right, so let's just save this file, save as 14, and then export. So mesh, armature, export FBX. Let's change the file name so we're not overriding. Same settings as before, so selected objects, everything else is okay, that's all right. Geometry, that's okay. Armature, again, disable add leaf bones. And then we need the bake animation, so double check that NLA strips is disabled and force end start keying. And export. Now Studio. So let's create a new project. Create. It's got the accessory open again. Derive. Get rid of the cage. And then import. Import FBX, number 14. Right, so it's got two animations, but we'll see if that's the morph. So that's a preview of the contents of the file. Setup FBX, 0.01, 4 bones, 1 mesh. That's all right. Textures, that's all right. No, it hasn't brought in our morph animation. So let's cancel this. This is where it gets tricky for accessory items. So if you're doing an animated accessory that has a morph animation with it, what you may find you have to do, so let's just double check. So that's the morph, and this is the skeletal animation. So that's our idle, it doesn't do anything. So it didn't bring the idle animation in either, and this is what was meant about. FBX doesn't like these kinds of blank files because it thinks there's nothing going on. So we have to think of something. Maybe just give it a slight pose mode. So this is now where this kind of thing gets a little bit tricky, because we could make it breathe, but we need another bone for that, because otherwise this is just basically moving up and down relative to the ground plane, which doesn't necessarily look too realistic per se. I mean, obviously it's a pumpkin with an eye. That's not exactly the most realistic thing that you can see, but if we had another bone, let's say at the top here, and it was set up so that it controlled the upper half of the pumpkin. So if the top was white painted red, so it had full control over that, and by the time it got down to here, it was pale blue, which is minimal influence. What you could do is squash the pumpkin up and down to create a breathing motion. So this is where it does require a little bit of forethought in terms of, I mean, if we were using old school Cal 3D exporter, it wouldn't necessarily be a problem. But for FBX it is. It doesn't like these blank files. So notwithstanding putting another bone in this, we have to think of something that we can do that makes IMVU think that there is, well, not make it think that there's something there, that it uses what is there. So I think what we might have to do is just give it a slight we'll probably have to make this sequence longer as well. So copy those two, pose, copy. Whoops. Insert. Insert. Copy. Let's just dump that in 120. So that's our reset. So as always with these types of cycling or repeating animations, the first and last frames are exactly the same. They're duplicates. Copy. Paste. Insert. Copy. Paste. Insert. Then it just returns back to so that will be our idle animation. Save this 14, no, is this 14, 15, 15, save as. let's try exporting that. So object mode, pumpkin, armature, export FBX 15. So same settings as before. Geometry is okay. Disable, add leaf bones, and make sure that NLA strips and the other one at the bottom that's not hidden under, there it is. Disable those. Export. Right, so Studio. Oh, we'll use this file that we've got open. So import FBX, number 15. So it's now got 4 animations. So setup 0.01, pumpkin body, next. Materials, that's okay, next. So we now have our idle sequence. So that's the one that we're just creating. So before, if the sequence is completely blank, there's nothing going on in it, even though you may have set out a sequence that is, as we did, was well, however many frames it was originally, I think it was 60. If there's nothing going on in the file, the FBX and IMVU import process doesn't see anything in the file. It considers the file blank, so it won't bring in the data. So if you put in some, it can be just one frame of difference. This is why we do the static poses. When we do the static poses, we set those up so that we have our static pose as a frame range, and then we have our reset, which resets the skeleton back to 0. Because without that difference between the pose and the reset, the process doesn't understand the FBX file containing any animation data and ignores it. So always keep that in mind when we're working with animations. So review, it's bringing in all this stuff, import. So it's going to drop it at his head. Components, skeleton, node, female 03. So it drops it into place. Set up our action. Actions. Click on the plus. That creates our new action. We're going to call this stance.idle, stance.idle. So that is the name and the trigger, as we were saying earlier. We need our ensemble. Click on that. And of course, our name is super duper long, so can't tell which one it is. So let's do a little trick, see if we can do this. Which one's the... We should have... Oh, there we go. So we can rename these. Rename. Let's just call it idle.action. Where did that go? There it is. So if we get these extraordinarily long names, for our sequences, because of the way that the FBX exporter works, it brings in these ridiculously long names because it's pulling in all the identifying name labels and data that's associated with the sequence. We can rename them. So all we have to do is go into the Assets tab, select the sequence or mouse over the sequence and we'll get the little 3 more button. Click on that, rename. Now we can rename this look see dot action. There is a way to there it is, open in folder. So we've got 2 options. We can either rename the selected element by clicking rename, or we can click open in folder and it'll open up the standard file browser where we can, we have to save the file first, because at the moment all the data is held in memory until we save it. When we save it, all that information will be dropped into this folder. So at the moment it's just creating temporary memory data. Right, so where were we? Component, action, stance idle, ensemble, select our asset, idle, that's all right, place, that's okay, all that's all right, then just apply, preview, and it does do it. It's very subtle. So let's edit that a little bit. So configure. Just loop that infinitely, so 0. Preview. And it's playing the sequence. So it can be a little tricky to work with animation now that we're using FBX only, or FBX really is the way forward. It can be a little tricky to work with. Oh, there's something that we've forgotten to do. It's completely unrelated to animation, but so yes, animations can be a little tricky to work with because we have to keep in mind particularly this sequence problem, that if the sequence is blank or appears to be blank, you've got the first frame and the last frame being exactly the same and nothing going on in between, IMVU won't recognize any data in the file and will consider it to be blank. So that means that when you are setting up your projects, you might have to think about compensating for that, so that you can't just have a static object sitting doing nothing. So it has to be doing something. So when originally we were setting the skeleton up, I mean, we can do this after the fact, but won't do that now. We could put a third bone at the top here, and as we were saying earlier, we could have that controlling the upper half of the skeleton. So full control at the top here, and then maybe, I don't know, 125% down at the bottom here, so negligible. So we can grab that bone and move the top half up and make it look like the character is breathing. And then if we drop that into the sequence, we'd have a proper, air quotes, a proper idle animation. Otherwise we have to start doing things like this, where we have to move the avatar, which we may not actually want to be doing. I mean, it looks all right, but so that's one of the things that I have to keep an eye on. But that is an animated accessory. And it's the same as we were saying earlier. It's the same if it's a tail, animated ring, animated earrings, doesn't matter. It's all the same principle. The only difference is where these items are uploaded in the catalogue. We don't have pets in here, do we? No, unless we derive from a pet. So, accessories as a category, catalogue category, and accessories as a fundamental skeleton. And this is why you can sometimes find accessories in clothing and vice versa, because in the catalogue it's just a category, but in IMVU, not IMVU, in Blender we have to build them in a particular way in order for them to work as expected. But that is some simple animation. I will have a look at morph animation, and then maybe we'll do a follow-up with the morph animation, because it can be a bit tricky to work with. Because what the character really needs to make the idle is a blink, and there are several properties that we can use down here where we can randomize the behavior of the blink, so it's not repetitive. It loops, but it'll loop in a sort of a randomized way. So I'll take a look at that and then maybe do a follow-up. But that is, whoops, an animated accessory item. Right, so we've been going for about an hour, so we'll call it quits there, and if there's a follow-up, there's a follow-up. Otherwise, that is our animated accessory. So, thanks for lurking, lurkers, and thanks for dropping by, Oliver, Queen, and we shall see you on the next stream. So, bye for now.